The story always begins in silence. A silence so heavy it presses against the walls of the soul, where words no longer have the power to wound, and gestures no longer carry the weight of chains. This silence is not emptiness. It is a weapon. It is a mirror. It is the dark gift of detachment. The man stands before her, armored in the illusion of control. His voice rises not because he is powerful, but because he is afraid of the void her stillness reveals. He senses that something has shifted, that the strings he once pulled no longer reach her heart. His ego trembles, even as he pretends to stand tall. For centuries, men have mistaken dependence for devotion and possession for love. They have learned to build empires on the fragile architecture of control. Yet the feminine, when awakened, when no longer needing to beg, to explain, to soften, becomes the earthquake that shatters the false foundations of his ego. Carl Jung once spoke of the shadow, that dark, unseen realm where all the unlived lives, the unspoken fears, the repressed desires, wait like wolves in the night. His ego, so carefully polished, so desperate to be admired, fears her detachment because it awakens his shadow. Suddenly, the reflection he has avoided begins to stare back at him through her silence. She does not touch him. She does not plead. She does not fight to be seen. Instead, she withdraws the one currency his ego cannot live without: her attention. The gaze that once fed him, the care that once nurtured him, the emotional labor that once repaired his fragile pride, gone. This absence becomes a haunting presence. The Stoics taught that power lies not in conquering another, but in mastering the self. Detachment is the feminine embodiment of this mastery. It is not coldness, not cruelty, but a return of the soul to its own center. She is no longer entangled in his storms. She watches the thunder rage, but her roots remain deep in the soil of her own worth. And this is how the ego begins to break. Not with confrontation, not with fire, not with endless arguments, but with the unbearable weight of her absence. His mind races. He projects. He accuses. He tries to provoke. But the more she steps back into herself, the louder his shadow screams inside him. The dance of Anima and Animus awakens here. The feminine energy withdraws, forcing the masculine to confront his inner feminine, the neglected anima he has denied, mocked, or repressed. Suddenly, he must face the hunger within himself, a hunger no woman can fill until he confronts it. And yet, the irony remains. It was her detachment that forced this reckoning. This is the dark gift. It is not given lightly, nor is it free of cost. For the woman, it requires courage, the courage to step away from patterns of self-sacrifice, to endure the discomfort of his rage, his confusion, his desperate attempts to reassert control. It requires faith in the quiet truth that love without freedom is not love, but bondage. Her detachment is the whisper of the soul returning home. And though he may fight it, though his ego may resist, the seed of transformation has been planted. What he does with it is his journey. But what she has done is simple, eternal. She has broken his ego without lifting a hand, without raising her voice, without touching him at all. Projection always follows detachment like a shadow chasing the body. When she steps away, when her eyes no longer bend toward him, when her silence no longer cushions his insecurities, his mind cannot bear the emptiness. So it fills it with stories. He projects. He casts his inner chaos onto her calm surface. He accuses her of cruelty, though she has said nothing cruel. He calls her cold, though her heart still burns quietly with dignity. He insists she must love another, because his ego cannot imagine that she simply loves herself enough to walk away from the game. This is the first fracture of his mask. Projection reveals what lies beneath the armor of his identity. Every insult he hurls, every accusation he invents, every desperate plea disguised as anger, all of it reflects the shadow he has buried. The detachment of the feminine does not create his fears, it only uncovers them. Carl Jung described projection as the unconscious thrusting itself onto another, the ego refusing to acknowledge its own wounds. The man, unable to bear the truth of his fragility, hurls it at her. And yet, her silence, her refusal to absorb it, creates a mirror too clean to distort. In this mirror, he sees himself more clearly than ever before. He is forced into confrontation with his own emptiness. The laughter that once covered his doubt now sounds hollow. The authority he once believed unshakable now quivers like a candle in wind. Every attempt to reassert control falls flat, because the audience, the woman who once played her role in his theater, is no longer performing. Her detachment, then, becomes his initiation. It is the threshold where his ego begins to starve. He must now choose, to descend into rage, into endless denial, or to awaken to the truth that his power was never real, only borrowed from her devotion. And what of her? What becomes of the woman who learns this art of detachment? She begins to breathe differently. Her chest no longer carries the weight of someone else's storm. Her hands are no longer raw from mending what he kept breaking. She begins to hear herself again, her own thoughts, her own desires, her own dreams, once buried under the noise of his demands. It is here that individuation begins, the sacred Jungian journey of becoming whole. For as long as she poured her energy into sustaining his ego, she lived fragmented, exiled from her own soul. But the act of detachment is the act of recalling the pieces, of weaving herself back into herself. His ego feels broken, but her essence begins to bloom. The paradox deepens. The more he fights to hold on to her, the less he possesses her. The more she surrenders to her own autonomy, the more magnetic she becomes. For nothing draws the ego more strongly than what it cannot control. And so, his obsession begins. Not with her body, not with her touch, but with the silence that has replaced the predictable patterns of her sacrifice. The silence that reflects back to him his own hunger, his own fragility, his own shadow. This is why the dark gift of detachment is not cruelty, but alchemy. It turns her absence into his mirror, his pride into dust, and his false power into the ashes from which he must choose whether to rise. Illusions are the most fragile architecture of the human psyche. They shimmer like glass palaces in the sun, dazzling, impressive, and yet built to shatter at the slightest tremor of truth. A man's ego, especially one fed on constant reassurance, thrives on illusion. He believes her devotion is endless. He believes her patience is permanent. He believes her world orbits around his gravity. But detachment shatters the glass. Suddenly, he finds himself wandering through rooms that no longer echo with her laughter, no longer bend toward his moods. The once invisible scaffolding of her presence, the soft reminders, the small acts of care, the quiet forgiveness, collapses. He is left in a palace stripped of its walls, exposed to the winds of reality. Carl Jung spoke of the anima, the feminine figure within the male psyche, the unconscious muse that shapes his relationship to love and meaning. When a woman withdraws, when she reclaims herself, she awakens this inner figure within him. But it does not awaken gently. It rises like a ghost, haunting him with her absence. He mistakes this haunting for her, but in truth, it is his own soul knocking at the doors he has long kept locked. This is why obsession takes root when she detaches. The man does not chase her alone. He chases the part of himself she once carried for him. He pursues the illusion of his completeness, projected onto her body, her attention, her love. When that projection dissolves, he feels as though a piece of his being has been ripped away. And yet, she knows the truth. She understands now that what he misses is not her essence, but the version of himself reflected in her devotion. The man, in his blindness, confuses love with possession, care with control, intimacy with validation. He believes her absence wounds him, but in reality, it is the loss of the mirror that injures his pride. Her silence burns through the illusions he clings to. He tells himself she is selfish, unkind, ungrateful. But beneath these accusations is a deeper wound, the terror of facing life without her as the scaffolding of his identity. And what of her? The woman who dares to step back? She feels both the grief and the power of this unraveling. For detachment is not numbness. It is not the cold absence of feeling. It is the quiet discipline of choosing herself, again and again, even when his pull tries to tether her back. The archetype of the feminine in this moment is not the submissive nurturer but the sovereign queen, one who rules herself, not by domination, but by refusal. Her refusal to play the role written for her. Her refusal to exchange her light for his shadow. Her refusal to collapse back into the patterns of sacrifice. And in this refusal, she dismantles not just his illusions, but her own. For once, she too believed his power was real. She too believed love meant endurance, meant bending until she broke. But detachment uncovers the truth. His control was never power, only her permission. And once withdrawn, the illusion dissolves into air. Thus begins the slow undoing of the ego, not through confrontation, not through battle, but through absence. For nothing terrifies the fragile mask of pride more than a woman who no longer needs to touch him to break him. Detachment is not an escape. It is not a flight into indifference, nor a mask of coldness. It is a rite of passage, a sacred crossing where a woman steps beyond the old myths that chained her and into the wilderness of her own becoming. In the silence she cultivates, there is no collapse into bitterness, no frantic need to replace what she has released. Instead, there is a deep stillness, a quiet, like the hush of dawn before the first bird sings. It is in this silence that she discovers herself, not as a reflection of him, but as a sovereign flame, burning independent of any gaze. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the great work of the soul, the lifelong unfolding of the true self, stripped of masks, stripped of borrowed roles. For too long, she wore the mask of the caregiver, the pleaser, the one who dimmed her radiance so he might feel tall in her shadow. But detachment tears away that mask, leaving only the raw, luminous truth of who she is. And the truth unsettles him. For in reclaiming herself, she strips him of the illusion of dominance. He sees now what he feared most, that she was never his possession, never his extension, never his certainty. The power he thought was his was always on loan, gifted by her devotion, her softness, her willingness to bear his weight. In detachment, she does not raise her voice. She does not argue, demand, or plead. She simply steps back. And this quiet shift becomes louder than any scream. It is the roar of her absence. The absence of her smile, her patience, her endless giving. The absence that leaves him stranded in the echo of his own emptiness. Yet, while his ego cracks under the silence, she feels something else entirely, the birth of dignity. A dignity that cannot be bought with apologies or sweet words. A dignity rooted in her bones, ancient and unshakable, older than every story of submission whispered into the ears of women across centuries. This is the paradox of detachment. It looks like loss, yet it is gain. It appears as withdrawal, yet it is expansion. She is not shrinking away from him, she is rising beyond him. And in that rising, she begins to taste the intoxicating freedom of her own soul. A freedom no hand can hold, no demand can cage, no ego can command. But here lies the mystery. As she pulls away, as she rises in her sovereignty, the very thing he thought he controlled begins to slip through his fingers. The more she detaches, the more his desire grows, feeding not on love, but on lack. He begins to see her not as the fragile figure he once took for granted, but as something untouchable, something burning just beyond his reach. And it is this untouchability that breaks his ego. For nothing wounds a man's pride more deeply than realizing he has no claim on the woman who once gave him everything. When she detaches, she does more than withdraw her presence. She holds up a mirror so clear, so unflinching, that he can no longer escape the truth of himself. Jung taught that the shadow is not a monster lurking outside of us, but the hidden part of the psyche we refuse to acknowledge. And for him, the shadow had always been carefully hidden behind her devotion, her forgiveness, her endless willingness to soften his rough edges and cover his sins with her patience. But now, without her shield, he stands naked before his own reflection. It is here, in the dark corridors of solitude, that he encounters the truth he fears. His arrogance was weakness disguised as strength. His control was dependency dressed as authority. His pride was nothing but a brittle mask, cracking under the weight of her absence. The irony is sharp. For all his insistence that she needed him, he discovers it was he who clung to her softness, to her steady presence, to the quiet balm she offered to his restless ego. Without her, he is unmoored, drifting in the silent space where her laughter once filled the air, where her care once stitched together the fractures in his soul. And as he faces his shadow, he is forced into a choice. He can deny it, sink deeper into rage and blame, or he can confront it, though few men are ready for this initiation. Detachment is her gift, but it is also his trial. It cracks him open, forces him to see what he has long buried beneath bravado and dominance. The truth gnaws at him in ways her words never could. Because words he could dismiss, arguments he could twist, tears he could overlook. But silence? Detachment? The refusal to play the game? That is a language beyond his control. And this is where the true breaking happens. Not in the heat of confrontation, but in the cold echo of her absence. Not in her anger, but in her indifference. For ego feeds on resistance, thrives on conflict. But detachment starves it, suffocates it, leaves it gasping in the vacuum of non-response. Her detachment does not destroy him. It destroys the illusion of him, the fragile structure he mistook for power. And once that illusion shatters, he is left with only himself, the raw, unpolished self he cannot outrun. And she? She does not gloat, she does not seek revenge, she does not return to check the ruins of what she has left behind. She walks forward, her silence intact, her dignity unbroken, her soul expanding into the space once taken by his demands. This is the essence of the dark gift, not punishment, but revelation. A gift that frees her, but one that may haunt him forever. Detachment, once born from necessity, begins to weave itself into her very being, not as armor but as a crown. For so long, she believed closeness meant safety, that her giving was the glue that held everything together. But as she steps back, she discovers the opposite. The less she bends, the more she stands. The less she clings, the more she soars. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the sacred process of becoming whole, integrating shadow, ego, anima, animus, and in her silence, she feels this process unfolding within. She is no longer the reflection of his needs. She is no longer the balm for his unhealed wounds. She is no longer the character in the story he wrote for himself. Instead, she becomes her own story. The archetypal sovereign, the queen who sits upon her throne not because someone handed it to her, but because she built it from the ruins of her own sacrifice. And he feels it. The shift. The way she no longer orbits his moods, no longer stretches herself to cushion his falls. His ego, once bloated by her submission, now gasps for air in the vacuum of her detachment. The energy he once drained from her now circles back to her, making her glow in a way that is both mysterious and terrifying. This glow is not vanity. It is not performance. It is the radiance of self-possession, the kind of radiance men cannot buy, demand, or control. It is the silent allure of a woman who does not need. The paradox burns him. The moment she stops needing, his obsession begins. For her absence presses upon him harder than her presence ever did. Her silence screams louder than her words. Her detachment makes him ache in places he did not know existed. But she has moved beyond the need to ache for him. Detachment has turned her pain into wisdom, her silence into power, her solitude into sanctuary. She no longer measures her worth by his recognition. She no longer waits for validation from the same mouth that once spoke half-truths and hollow promises. She no longer defines love by how much she can endure. For she has discovered the secret that makes her untouchable. Real power is not in holding on, it is in letting go. And in that letting go, she claims something far greater than his love. She claims herself. Detachment becomes alchemy. It is no longer the act of simply pulling away, nor the absence of longing. It is the transformation of energy, a crucible where pain, rejection, and disappointment are burned down into something luminous and strange. Every tear that once fell for him now feeds a deeper fire within her. Every silence he forced upon her becomes a space she fills with her own voice, her own breath, her own rhythm. What was once an emptiness turns into a field of abundance, and she learns the oldest truth of feminine power. Absence is not weakness. It is magnetism. Jung called this the work of the shadow, to take what was rejected, abandoned, despised, and to bring it back into the circle of wholeness. In the beginning, she had banished her own shadow, silencing her anger, her disappointment, her unmet desires, believing they were too much. But detachment forces her to look at them, to embrace them, to say, "Yes, I am more than what you wanted me to be." In that moment, she ceases to be merely the woman he chose. She becomes the woman he cannot define, the woman who unsettles his sleep, the woman whose absence is heavier than her presence. Her detachment begins to erode the very ego he built upon her submission. He feels the sting of being unseen, not because she is blind, but because she has chosen not to look. Her eyes, once mirrors for his vanity, now turn inward, illuminating her own depths. And without that reflection, his ego trembles. What unsettles him is not rage, not revenge, not confrontation. It is the calm, the poise, the refusal to explain, the refusal to perform. Her detachment does not scream, it whispers. It does not chase, it withdraws. It does not plead, it stands. And in this stillness lies the dark gift, the invisible force that bends him without her lifting a hand. For what he does not understand is this: she is no longer his audience, nor his anchor, nor his confessor. She is her own world, her own myth, her own unfolding story. And when a woman reaches this state, she becomes untouchable. Not cold, not cruel, but sovereign. This is the alchemy of detachment, turning loss into magnetism, silence into allure, and absence into a crown of power. The unraveling begins quietly. He tells himself that her silence means nothing, that her absence is a game, that she will return like she always has. Yet beneath the armor of his ego, a fissure opens. The man who once believed himself invincible now feels the tremor of something he cannot control, her withdrawal. In Jungian language, what is crumbling is his identification with the persona, the mask he wore to be admired, adored, obeyed. That mask had power only when reflected back by her gaze. Without her recognition, the mask collapses into dust, leaving him face to face with what he has avoided all along, the emptiness of his own shadow. He begins to replay their conversations, searching for clues. He imagines her laughter in other rooms, with other men, in other worlds where he no longer matters. He dreams of her voice but cannot hear it. He reaches for her presence but finds only the cold geometry of silence. This is how obsession is born, not from love, but from the hunger of an ego denied its nourishment. He does not crave her essence. He craves the way she once made him feel. She was the mirror, the stage, the sanctuary of his significance. Without it, he trembles. Without it, he is nothing. The paradox deepens. The more he seeks her, the further she drifts. The more he grasps, the more intangible she becomes. She no longer participates in the endless cycle of proving, pleasing, and softening his edges. She is not punishing him, not playing a role. She is simply gone from the theater of his ego. And in this, his shadow rises. The rage of abandonment, the fear of insignificance, the desperation of a child who once cried for a mother who did not come. All of it rushes to the surface, flooding him with memories he cannot name, wounds he cannot articulate. What unnerves him most is her composure. She does not fight, she does not accuse, she does not even demand closure. She simply walks in the quiet authority of one who has remembered her worth. That calmness, that sovereignty, becomes unbearable to his fractured ego, for it proves what he always feared: she does not need him. And the moment she no longer needs him is the moment he begins to need her in ways that consume him. The nights grow longer for him. What once felt like victory, her dependence, her soft reliance on his approval, is gone. Now he feels the raw pulse of absence. He looks at his phone in the dark, waiting for her name to appear, yet it remains silent, glowing with the indifference of the universe itself. In his mind, she becomes everywhere. Her face appears in passing strangers, her voice echoes in the rhythms of songs, her scent lingers in empty spaces. Yet she is nowhere he can touch. This is the crucifixion of the ego, the unbearable truth that he cannot summon her with charm, with power, with promises. And still, she does not move toward him. Her detachment becomes alchemy. Like a priestess in a temple of silence, she radiates something he cannot corrupt, the authority of self-possession. Jung would call this the individuation of the feminine. She has stepped beyond the chains of projection, no longer casting him as savior or destroyer. She has called back her own power, withdrawn her anima from his grip, and in doing so she stands complete. This completion is what burns him most. He is haunted not by her anger, but by her serenity. Not by her rejection, but by her indifference. Anger he could fight, rejection he could negotiate, but her peace is impenetrable. It is the mirror he cannot crack. In this haunting, obsession takes its throne. He begins to oscillate between longing and rage, between memories of her warmth and fantasies of her collapse. He wants her to come back, yet he also wants her to suffer the emptiness he now feels. This duality is not love, it is the ego's death throes, thrashing against the void she has revealed. And yet, quietly, another truth stirs beneath the chaos. The very wound he feels is the one he has always carried, the fracture of his unhealed shadow. She has not broken him, she has unveiled him. Detachment, in this light, is not cruelty. It is revelation. It is the feminine showing him, without a word, without a touch, the prison of his own illusions. Her silence is a sermon. Her absence, a mirror. Her indifference, the initiation he never wanted but now cannot escape. The storm inside him cannot last forever. At first, obsession feeds on itself, desire tangled with rage, memory laced with fantasy. But like a fire consuming its own oxygen, it begins to collapse. His grasping, his longing, his attempts to force her image back into the shape of his possession only leave him more exhausted. The walls of his ego, once towering, are now cracked and trembling. And here, in this quiet wreckage, surrender begins. It is not the surrender of devotion, but of recognition. He begins to see that what he was chasing was never her, not truly. He was chasing the reflection of himself in her eyes, the reassurance that his ego existed because she needed him. But now her absence has ripped that reflection away, and he is left to face himself, bare and unadorned. This is where Jung's shadow rises. Every hidden weakness, every unhealed wound, every dependency he masked with power, all stand revealed. She has not defeated him, she has unmasked him. And in that revelation, the illusion he built of her collapses. For her, this is not victory. It is not revenge. It is liberation. She has severed the invisible cords that once drained her light into his emptiness. She no longer carries the weight of his projections. She no longer exists as the fragile mirror of his self-worth. Her detachment becomes more than silence. It becomes archetype. She is no longer just a woman in his story. She becomes something older, something mythic, the Anima who withdrew, the goddess who ascended, the eternal reminder that no man owns the soul of a woman who has claimed herself. And for him, the obsession shifts into awe. He begins to realize that her power is not in what she gives, but in what she withholds. Not in how she bends, but in how she stands unmoved. His ego cracks under the weight of this realization, and in its shattering lies the beginning of something he has never known: humility. For the first time, he sees her not as an extension of himself, but as an untouchable presence, whole, radiant, and beyond his grasp. And in that moment, whether he admits it or not, she becomes unforgettable. Because the greatest wound a man can feel is not rejection, but the haunting knowledge that she no longer needs him, and never will again. Silence becomes her crown. In the world he once controlled, where his words held weight and his attention decided her worth, she now moves untethered. He no longer dictates her rhythm. She no longer dances to the sound of his validation. Her steps are her own, each one a quiet hymn to the self she reclaimed. What began as absence has transformed into presence, not the presence of him, but of her soul. The Anima, once imprisoned in his expectations, has dissolved those chains. Now she embodies the mystery he cannot solve, the distance he cannot cross, the radiance that does not diminish when denied. And as he lingers in the ruins of his ego, she ascends. Not upward into arrogance, but inward, toward a center untouched by possession. This is the essence of Jung's individuation, when the feminine no longer seeks completion in another, but discovers she was whole all along. His obsession, his hunger, his fractured attempts to reclaim what was lost, they dissolve into shadows trailing behind her light. He cannot follow where she has gone, for it is not a place but a state of being, a sanctuary built on self-worth, silence, and the dark, unyielding power of detachment. She does not break him with anger, nor destroy him with cruelty. She breaks the illusion that he ever had her at all. And that truth, sharper than any blade, pierces deeper than touch. The lesson of detachment is not punishment. It is revelation. Revelation that love cannot be owned, that desire cannot enslave, that the soul of the feminine belongs to no one but herself. And in this revelation, the balance shifts forever. He will remember her not as the woman who begged, nor the one who yielded. He will remember her as the silence that taught him humility, the absence that taught him longing, and the presence that taught him what true power feels like. She does not return to the role he wrote for her. She has burned the script. She writes her own now. And in that truth lies the dark gift of detachment, the power to shatter his ego without ever laying a hand upon him. If these words stirred something deep within you, it is not by accident. The shadow speaks when the soul is ready to hear. Do not silence it. Let it guide you. Subscribe not for noise, but for reminders of your own power. Share this with the women who have forgotten their crown, and let them remember. And if his ego ever tried to claim you, leave your truth in the comments below, because your silence here does not serve you, but your voice might free another. This journey is only beginning. Detachment is not the end of love. It is the rebirth of self. Walk with us. Stand in your sovereignty. And let the world see what happens when a woman no longer bends. Subscribe. Speak your truth. The world changes when women stop bending.